Hi, so hello and welcome to the second day of Out of Bounds. I'm happy to see some people for the first time and some people from yesterday. But yeah, it's been really, really lovely and some really important discussions yesterday. And it's just been, yeah, a delight to have you all. And I'm so glad to see you here again today. So I will now hand over to Tom, who will introduce our upcoming panel 4.
Yes, perfect. So yeah, good morning everyone, and thanks for coming back in again. And just wanted to offer another thanks to all of our speakers yesterday, and for the two people who took over chairs, Connor and Sahar, who had that down to a fine art. That was wonderful. And you're actually going to hear from both of them today in their own panels. But our first panel, I'll be handing over in a second to Callum Bateson, who'll be chairing this. And this is another panel to try and sort of deal with our contemporary moment, this time with a climate perspective. So could we pass on to Callum then? I'll just get you to unmute.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Okay, cool. So welcome and good morning, everyone. Also, I hope everyone has coffee because I'd say that would be helpful. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this panel. Should be very interesting just to reflect on what we've just on yesterday's intersectional ideas, which connect very nicely to the idea of non-human boundaries, eco-criticism, and the Anthropocene. We have 3 fascinating sounding speakers, all looking at different aspects of literary criticism. So we're going to have Céline Thobois of TCD, or Trinity College Dublin, Conor Brennan, also of Trinity College Dublin, and finally Dr. Georgina Nugent-Folan from the Ludwig Maximilian Universität in Munich. So I'm going to not spend too much time blathering on because, yeah, try and keep in time. But just do a tiny bit of, I suppose, reminding of housekeeping, although I suppose people are probably a bit bored of hearing it at this stage. So yeah, the talk's going to be, as everyone knows, I suppose 20 minutes long, roughly. I'm not going to be hyper strict on time, but me or Tom or Alicia probably will hop in if you're talking for like 50 minutes. And then there'll be time at the end for questions, which will be done either in the chat or, I mean, there's not millions of people here yet. So also, if you feel more comfortable just raising your hand, I can get to you. And yeah, that's about it. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Céline Thobois. Céline is an Irish Research Council funded PhD student at the Drama Department and a co-convener of the Samuel Beckett Reading Group in Trinity College Dublin. Her current research is looking at the relationship between the human, technology and the environment in Samuel Beckett's drama through the prisms of behaviorism and neuroscience. And she'll be presenting a paper today titled Undoing Human Boundaries in Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot and Endgame. So Céline, if you'd like to take the floor.
Hi everyone, thanks Callum for the introduction, and thank you Alicia and Tom for organizing this conference. I'm delighted to be here and I can't wait to hear Connor and Georgina as well. So bear with me 1 second while I share my screen, and I hope you can see this now. So the crisis of boundaries is central to Samuel Beckett's work and to his own artistic vision. So my aim for today is to show you how Beckett's drama provides us with a fruitful legacy to rethink what it means to be human in the Anthropocene, or to say it with Timothy Morton's words, how Beckett's drama provides us 21st century artists and audiences with a way to, I quote, stick around with the sticky mess that we are in and that we are. So in an interview with Tom Driver, professor of literature and theology at Columbia University, Beckett famously said, "The confusion is not my invention. We cannot listen to a conversation for 5 minutes without being acutely aware of the confusion. It's all around us, and our only chance now is to let it in. The only chance of renovation is to open our eyes and see the mess. It's not a mess you can make sense of. What I'm saying does not mean that there will henceforth be no form in art. It only means that there will be new form, and that this form will be of such a type that it admits the chaos and does not try to say that the chaos is really something else. To find a form that accommodates the mass, that is the task of the artist now. Seeing is the fundamental epistemological and aesthetic act here. However, it's not an act of rationality and ordering. It is primarily a physical experience which imprints sensations on the observer. The cognitive task of the observer, then, is to process the perceived chaos as is and navigate it. The mission of the artist, which seems to be of ethical order, is to find the adequate aesthetics attuned to the unnameable, the unknowable, the unstable, and the unpredictable. The human subject therefore remains at the center of this epistemological system, but there's a crucial shift from the thinking subject to the feeling subject. What is in crisis, therefore, is reason. As a result, the humanist definition and performance of the human is teetering as a whole. This crisis of the human and of human boundaries underpins Beckett's oeuvre. As Anna McMullen argues, Beckett's microcosms are not slices of the living world, but models of alternative worlds in which the anthropos is placed under observation. It is therefore not only the conditions of the ecosystem that are of interest, but also how the ecosystem is defined, created, and observed. In this paper, I'll focus on the dramaturgic strategies deployed to undo the boundaries of the human and human-made boundaries in the ecosystems of Waiting for Godot and Endgame. So before diving into these two plays, I'd like to come back to the context in which the plays were written, as it is central to my argument. And I'd like to do so through a text that Beckett wrote for Radio Iran in 1946, entitled The Capital of the Ruins. After the war, Beckett engaged in the Irish Red Cross in Saint-Lô in Normandy, where he was hired as quartermaster interpreter. In the passage of Damned to Fame, dedicated to Beckett's work in Saint-Lô, James Knowlson, his biographer, tellingly concludes that the war years as a whole had a profound effect on Beckett. It's difficult to imagine him writing the stories, novels, and plays that he produced in the creative maelstrom of the immediate post-war period without the experiences of those 5 years. A new vision of the human within their ecosystem comes across quite clearly in Beckett's account of the aftermath of the bombarding in Saint-Lô. The text starts with the following description of the landscape. On what a year ago was a grass slope lying in the angle that the Vire and Bayeux roads make as they unite at the entrance of the town, opposite what remains of the second most important stud farm in France, a general hospital now stands. In this opening sentence of the report, Beckett's sensitivity to drastic changes in the landscape appears clearly. The grass slope is presented as the site of multiple dynamics between nature, humanity, the animal world, and technology. First, it occurs that the mention of the stud farm serves Beckett's efforts to make a precise account of the situation, and it remains a peripheral detail. Nevertheless, on second reading, it also seems to partake in the underlying reflection on the value and meaning of life. The stud farm, where horses are hosted for the breeding process, epitomizes the utilitarian relationship between human beings and animals. Animal life is treated as a mere commodity controlled by humans for economic and leisurely purposes. Second, the brief pastoral introduction of the place shows that this piece of land was spared as it was not occupied by people, as opposed to the town of Saint-Lô, which was reduced to ruins and rubble. This marginal intersection point of untouched nature was to become, Beckett explains, a central site of care for the victims, whom he purposefully does not refer to as human beings, but as the bombed out. The explosion of the human and of humanness is nevertheless balanced by two elements: the work and dedication of the Irish Red Cross staff and the scientific and technological means used to treat casualties of the bombing. Throughout the text, technology is indissociably presented both as hope and doom for life. The word bomb recurs across different grammatical forms, always to express the atomization of the human by means of technology. However, the introductory paragraph outlines with great detail how untouched nature was replaced with multiple structures dedicated to patient's care and made of numerous materials, techniques, and technologies. The paragraph ends with the magnificently equipped laboratory of the Hospital of the Irish Red Cross, which seems to have sparked off Beckett's interest and arguably his hope. Eventually, after that thorough description of space, with, I quote, few facts chosen not quite at random, and 2 acerbic paragraphs on the relationships and cultural differences between the Irish delegation, the locals, and the French administration, the text is concluded with a meditation on time, past, present, and future, encapsulated in the redefinition of provisional. Beckett observes that provisional is not the term it was in this universe become provisional. The ecological and ontological ruptures are visually and syntactically marked by the comma, which does not seem to serve a grammatical purpose here. The binary structure of the sentence is composed of a decasyllable followed by a hendecasyllable, a structural refusal of permanence itself. The line begins and ends with the adjective provisional, which is in the first instance isolated by inverted commas as a sort of widely accepted concept of physics, an acknowledgement of change as a fundamental characteristic of the universe. By the end of the sentence, inverted commas have disappeared, and the word provisional has been fully integrated to the syntactic system as a heightened paradigm of life, one that foregrounds high levels of unpredictability, contingency, and uncertainty. All 3 endorsed by scientists as phenomena of the Great Acceleration, the period of time, started in the mid-20th century and still ongoing, marked by accelerated global change. This aphorism is followed by conclusive lines extending thoughts on time and existence in 3 directions: practical, political, and philosophical. Some of those who were in Saint-Lô will come home realizing that they got at least as good as they gave, that they got indeed what they could hardly give, a vision and sense of a time-honored conception of humanity in ruins, and perhaps even an inkling of the terms in which our condition is to be thought again. This will have been in France. What seems of prime importance to Beckett is that the experience of the Irish people in Saint-Lô is not rendered as a tearful litany of their traumas or as an epic of what, I quote, might be called the heroic period. Instead, it reflects the imperious continental need, as opposed to the Irish nationalist preoccupations of the time, to transcend the borders of national agendas and authentically engage with the crisis of the human in a movement from the local to the universal, an ethical imperative that Beckett's drama reflects, notably by the creation of different types of environment, physical and virtual, in the theater and in the intermediate plays. I take Beckett's identification of a breach, his observation of the obsolescence, or perhaps more accurately, the unsuitability of the humanist model and terminology, and his formulation of a hope for new paradigms of life and humanity as an impulse to read Beckett's drama in the context of the Anthropocene and the Great Acceleration. To conclude this contextual part and move on to the plays, I'd like to show you this graph that we used at the Beckett and the Anthropocene conference to illustrate the ecological changes which occurred in Beckett's lifetime. The arrow going up marks Beckett's birth in 1906, and the arrow going down marks his death in 1989. The yellow line in the middle is the year 1950, and you can clearly see how the Earth system trends are drastically modified from this date onwards. The graph illustrates what Timothy Morton sums up as follows. The already existing ecological emergency resembles the anxiety about virtual reality that will be drowned in a psychotic soup where we won't be able to tell one thing from another. Only it also involves the possibility of our own death. It is very hard to get used to the idea that the catastrophe, far from being imminent, has already taken place. And this is crucial to Beckett's Waiting for Godot and Endgame, as both plays start in medias res. So the concept of in medias res may seem strange here, as both plays are characterized by stasis. Vivian Mercier, the Irish Times reviewer of Waiting for Godot, entitled his 1956 review, The Uneventful Event, and he comments, his first play shows consummate stagecraft. its author has achieved a theoretical impossibility, a play in which nothing happens that yet keeps audiences glued to their seats. What's more, since the second act is subtly different reprise of the first, he has written a play in which nothing happens twice. In the making of Samuel Beckett's En attendant Godot, Waiting for Godot, Dirk van Hoele and Pim Verhulst comment on the anticlimactic structure of Waiting for Godot, based on Beckett's reworking of Freytag's pyramid in his schoolboy copy of Macbeth. The set of Waiting for Godot, a post-catastrophe landscape, suggests that Beckett twisted the dramatic structure from the very start of the play. Unconventionally, it is through observation of the sets that audiences learn that the plays start after a determining catastrophic event. In Waiting for Godot, the minimal set creates an unwelcoming landscape, a tree without leaves, a road, and a mound on which Estragon is sitting. In Act 2, the only difference is the appearance of some leaves on the tree, but as Vladimir notes, decidedly, this tree will not have been of the slightest use to us. It cannot shelter them, it cannot feed them, they can't even hang themselves on the tree as it doesn't look strong enough. This landscape could hardly be called nature, and the experience of the characters confirms that this human-made concept is not helpful as it does not correspond to their world. Estragon, we should turn resolutely towards nature. Vladimir, we've tried that. In Endgame, the characters are stuck in a space that they refer to as the refuge from the onset of the play, making the situation of emergency really clear. This dimly lit space has only 2 windows located high up, suggested that it is underground. The 2 main characters of Waiting for Godot, Vladimir and Estragon, cannot leave as they are waiting for Godot to save them and they have nowhere to go. And those of Endgame, Ham and Clove, cannot leave either because, as Ham instructs Clove, outside of here, it's death. Again here, a drastic change has already occurred and makes it irrelevant to use the word nature to describe the world beyond the shelter, one that the audience can never see. It is the privilege or the curse of Clove alone. Clove describes the space he can see through the earth window as corpsed, and thinks that there's no more nature, although Ham makes him doubt himself. Nature has forgotten us. There's no more nature. No more nature, you exaggerate, in the vicinity, but we breathe, we change, we lose our hair, our teeth, our bloom, our ideals. Then she hasn't forgotten us. But you say there is none. No one that ever lived, ever thought so crooked as we. We do what we can, we shouldn't. Towards the end of the play, Clove even comes to the realization that nature might never actually have been. He says, I say to myself that the earth is extinguished, though I never saw it lit. They can't find any satisfactory way to go beyond the problem of nature. Clove touches on the inadequacy of language to mediate the world. I use the words you taught me. If they don't mean anything anymore, teach me others, or let me be silent. These circumstances of the new provisional force them to observe their worlds and reflect on their so-called human condition. What they learn is that reason is not sufficient to understand their world and survive, although they struggle to let go of reason and order. And I won't have time to go really in detail into this, so I've excerpted some passages. If you want to take screenshots and look at them later, you have the option to do that, and I'm sorry about that. They also realize that they are closer to the worm than they are to God. They are no exceptional species. They are earthen creatures like the others, struggling for their own survival with no way out of their world. The plots do not provide the reasons why the characters are in such extreme situations. Yet there are some allusions to the war, and genetic studies show that Beckett erased from the scripts explicit references to the Holocaust in Waiting for Godot and to the First World War in Endgame. The bowler hats in Waiting for Godot, a garment characteristic of the bourgeoisie of the early 20th century, and Ham's inquiry, no phone calls, can point to the first half of the 20th century as the socio-historical context in which the plays are taking place. In Waiting for Godot, Pozzo comments, the population has increased, and in Endgame, the rhetoric of pollution and waste directly references Western post-war concerns. Both plays raise the question of responsibility as to this situation. In Waiting for Godot, the tramps wonder if they should repent, and repent being born altogether. In the second act, they feel they represent humanity and that they need to act accordingly, and that is waiting. The parody of Shakespeare, to be or not to be, that is the question, here reworked as what are we doing here, that is the question, displaces the stakes from ontology to ethics. In Endgame, the question of responsibility is also raised as a generational issue. Ham is obsessed with holding his father responsible and refers to him as a cursed progenitor. In Endgame, Ham's enclosed duty is not the preservation of the species. On the contrary, they try their best to interrupt the cycle of life, as the flea and the rat episode illustrate. The passive attitude of characters in Godot and the nihilistic approach of those in Endgame serves as a form of comic relief from the bleakness of the character's life. The question of responsibility remains unresolved in the main plots, but in the two plays, the main action is interrupted by another plot. Ham, the soliloquizer, is sensitive to the effect of complications. As he's warming up for his last soliloquy, Clove catches sight of a small boy outside the shelter, and Ham comments, more complications, not an underplot, I trust. In the dramatic structure of both Waiting for Godot and Endgame, the arrival of Lucky and Pozzo and the appearance of Nag and Nell could be read as underplots, as they do not really disturb the main plot, but they seriously complicate the narrative of the Anthropocene. In both instances, they shift perspective from a recent new geological epoch due to a sudden catastrophic event such as the war, and require to incorporate more narratives into the story of the Anthropocene. Due to time constraints, I'll only focus on Lucky and Pozzo in this paper, but I'm happy to discuss Nag and Nell in the Q&A if you wish. Vladimir and Estragon are sensitive to geological time through the fossilization of bones. Vladimir, when I think of it, all these years, but for me, where would you be? You'd be nothing more than a little heap of bones at the present minute, no doubt about it. As Anna McMullen argues, bones also evoke vast periods of time from the temporalities of individual human memory or human history to cycles of geological time, which places the human in pre- or post-human landscape. Godot stages a post-anthropocentric vision that, while rooted in the phenomenological present, encourages an expanded perception which places the human in the frame of a dysfunctional creation, including the human, divine, even if absent, animal, vegetable, and objects, but also in a temporal frame that layers the present with fragments of memory and history, both recent and ancient. In Waiting for Godot, the master-slave scene fully partakes in the reframing of the human-environment relationship and history. As Vladimir and Estragon are going on with waiting, a terrible cry is heard. Pozzo and Lucky enter the stage. Pozzo drives Lucky by means of a rope passed around his neck. He carries Pozzo's belongings, who controls him by means of the rope and a whip. Pozzo introduces himself to Vladimir and Estragon as a landlord and tells them that they are on his land. Pozzo refers to Lucky as a slave and gives him orders, only resorting to animal names, think pig, up hog. Vladimir and Estragon are appalled by the way in which Pozzo treats Lucky. Vladimir tells Pozzo, it's a scandal to treat a man like that. I think that, no, a human being, no, it's a scandal. A disgrace, Estragon adds. They learn that Pozzo is taking Lucky to the fair to sell him. Vladimir asks, you want to get rid of him? Pozzo, I do, but instead of simply kicking him out on his arse, in the goodness of my heart, I'm bringing him to the fair, where I hope to get a good price of him. The truth is, I can't drive such creatures away. You can't drive such creatures away. The best thing would be to kill them. The master-slave duo of Pozzo and Lucky has been widely explored in Beckett studies. However, the story has never been analyzed in the context of the Anthropocene, and I would like to suggest that Pozzo's status of landlord and master, coupled with his habit of being a small smoker, further connecting him to slavery through the economics of tobacco, draws attention to the root causes of the Anthropocene which are not acknowledged by scientific discourses. Catherine Yusof argues in A Billion Black Anthropocenes that the processes of mastery of the soil and the processes of extraction at the core of the epistemology of geology are based on the same logic that of the inhuman, which creates an opportunity for exploitation and property. I quote, "Slavery is not a byproduct of this process. Rather, slavery is driven by an indifferent extractive geologic that is motivated by the desire for inhuman properties. Indigenous genocide and settler colonialism are also part of these extractive geologics. In this sense, slavery can be seen not as a confusion of subject-object in relation to inhuman categorization, but as a total submission of the principle of extraction that was exacted through inhuman differentiation, transformed through the human subject of his own culture into the inhuman object of the European culture." Estragon and Vladimir are infuriated at the start of their encounter with Pozzo and Lucky, but they become insensitive to Lucky's situation and, as representative of humanity, end up not doing anything for him. In Act 2, the duo comes back, and this time Pozzo is blind, and when Lucky and Pozzo fall down, Vladimir and Estragon follow Pozzo's instruction to put Lucky back on his feet for his menial tasks. This complication invites us to question the all-encompassing we, or humanity, of the Anthropocene, and to be more attentive to, I quote Yusof again, "the very bodies that undo strata, the theft of bodies of the flesh that hews the rock, that plants the sugar plantation, that blasts and gets blasted in the mines, that transports and carries the pathogens and pollutions of those spikes as processes of destratifications." To conclude, Beckett's plays do not only question who we are, but they invite us to reconsider how we tell about who we are and what we do. By performing Beckett's plays in site-specific locations and by adapting the set to our changing conditions, Beckettian practitioners make a meaningful contribution to the Anthropocene in opening creative spaces where our so-called human condition can be thought anew. Thank you.
Thanks a mil for that, Céline. That was super interesting. I have loads of things